what I'm hoping you see. Can we see, oops, this is a little too far ahead. There we go. Can we see that screen? Okay,
Yes.
Great, awesome. Well, in that case, I do want to take a quick second to introduce myself a little further, but start by saying how excited I am to be here, and I'm really honored to have this time with you all. My name is Karl Brevik, and I'm a law student at Sturm College of Law at the University of Denver. And it's no exaggeration when I say I'm honored to be working with Lyric, Learn Your Rights in the Community. And what we do is we go around to schools, after-school programs, and a lot of other venues, and we teach people about their rights, their constitutional rights, specifically their 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment rights, and even more specifically, how to safely exercise those rights whenever you're interacting with law enforcement. And even though I said specifically a bunch of times there, the key word is actually safely. We really want to find ways to make sure that as you exercise your rights, you get to do so in a safe manner that also ensures that your rights are protected. I do want to take a quick side note to say, remember that I'm just a law student. As much as I'd like to be, I am not yet an attorney, and that means I am definitely not any of your attorney. So nothing I'm saying here today is legal advice from me to you. I'm not allowed to do that. Lawyers aren't allowed to do that. And this is focused on what the Constitution says, not what Karl says. So I'm just kind of speaking for the Constitution since it can't speak for itself. And speaking of students and young people and all that, I want to reinforce that you're who I'm here for. I'm here to help protect your rights during law enforcement encounters. And so as this presentation goes on, if you have any questions, make sure you phrase them in the form of a hypothetical. Instead of, if you might know someone who's gone through something with a police encounter, or you might have gone through a police encounter yourself, but instead of saying, when this happened, or this happened to me, and frame questions in sort of hypotheticals, kind of made up situations to reinforce. It's my rule of thumb has always started to like, well, what if this happened? Or imagine if this happened, or feel free to throw up a big disclaimer that says, hypothetically, what if, all that good stuff. There we go. Always want to remind you that we have a lot of witnesses. There's over 50 people on this call right now. So anything you say is heard by them. So we're treating everything like a hypothetical, but not to reinforce that too much. Really, I do want you to feel comfortable, ask questions. I've got my little participant screen. If you can raise hand function, feel free to drop a question in the chat. If you're not comfortable speaking, feel free to interact. I am all about hearing what you have to say and making sure that your questions are answered before we get going too far. But to reinforce kind of where things are, normally, if we were doing this in person, I would be handing out these Give 'em 5 cards. And so instead, during this presentation, we're going to go back to this a lot, and I'll be in touch with, or someone from Lyric will be in touch with ways to possibly get these out to you. But for now, this is going to be coming up in the presentation a lot to kind of take a look. This is your script. I'm an actor, or I was an actor before I became a law student, and still try to be an actor as often as possible. So practicing lines is something I do outside of law school. Consider this your lines, should you ever have interaction with police. Before we get started, and this is, I'm not gonna even pretend to know what I'm doing here. The hardest thing I've had to do in law school is present videos on Zoom and then have them work. By far the hardest thing I've done so far. So we're gonna see, I'm gonna stop my share just long enough to restart it again, hopefully with that video. And since I can see, Terry, your screen when my thing is up, can you give me a thumbs up if the sound is coming through? Great. Let's go ahead and wait. Thank you for your patience on this. And this is where I will reinforce everything I did say about, make sure if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Great, pop this up. The sound coming through? No, okay, great. I have one thing to do.
Still no?
Carl, are you doing the share sound?
Well, we might have to.
There we go. No?
Can you repeat that, Vicki?
Are you doing the share sound command in the corner? Once you hit share screen in the lower left-hand corner, there's a little place that says share sound. Did you do that?
That's a good question. Share computer sound. There we go. Now we're gonna try it again. Great.
To the youth of Denver, let's write a love letter to our voices.
My voice is a canyon.
My voice is the sun itself.
My voice is power.
My voice is action.
To hear my voice is a privilege.
To use my voice is the greatest choice.
But my silence, oh, my silence is deafening.
My silence is an action too.
When I speak,
I am brilliant, I am safe, I am secure.
When I am silent,
I am brilliant, I am safe, I am secure.
So when a siren sounds
and the fear sets in,
my voice is the invitation of my own safety.
I not only want to be safe,
but commit myself to keep my safety mine.
My voice is the invocation.
And the spell is this.
am I free to leave?
If I am free, I will leave.
I choose to remain silent.
I want a lawyer.
I do not consent to the search of my body.
I do not consent to the search of my things.
Our voice is our right.
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 The choice to speak or remain silent
is an act of love.
I love my voice, so I choose my voice.
90% of youth waive their right to silence without even knowing what it means to do so, without understanding the choice. If we protect ourselves, we prioritize our voice, we prioritize our strength.
In order to invoke your rights,
You have to find your voice.
Let's find it and use it together.
So as I bring my presentation back up, I do want to take a quick question or a quick moment to say, I know that I've watched that video a lot as I prepare for this presentation and I get things rolling, and I tried to practice to bring it up on Zoom unsuccessfully. I got to watch it a lot. And every time I watched it, it was really powerful to me. So to kind of ice break us into, feeling comfortable asking questions or making comments, I did want to ask the group, is there something about that video that stood out to you? Or do you have a question about that video? Or anything like that? Because I know there's a lot to take in when I got to first see it. And you can feel free to just unmute and jump in if no one's talking, or pop a question in the chat or comment in the chat.
I have a question.
It felt like,
yes.
I don't know.
Sorry, Oscar?
So it said that 90% of youth waive the right to their silence without knowing what that means. Could you elaborate on that, please?
I sure can. No, and that's a really great question. I do appreciate that. We're going to cover that in a little more detail later on in the presentation. So if I don't cover it enough as we go on, definitely tap me for that. But even as a preface for that, it can be very easy to waive your right to remain silent, because imagine how you waive that right. It's usually just by not remaining silent. And if you're in a situation that is stressful or intimidating, or perhaps even it's a law enforcement officer that's very friendly, it can be very easy to just keep talking. And that's all it takes to waive your Fifth Amendment right. If you're talking, if you're speaking, your Fifth Amendment right isn't active in the moment. And so it's very easy to waive, and that's what we say. One thing I always like to say about your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent is a lot of people don't realize you don't have a right to remain silent. What you have is a right to say you want to remain silent, and then be silent. And those are the steps necessary. That's a really great question. We're going to cover that more as the presentation goes on. So definitely hit me up at the end if I haven't done enough. And I see some comments. I like how they said their voice was an action, and I thought that was really beneficial. Wonderful, wonderful insights. Your voice is your power in this. That's a big thing, and that's when you're speaking and when you're not. It's still powerful. But your voice can be an action, and that can, especially as situations are approached, something you can do, even if you have to do things or comply physically, you still have your voice. And that's a wonderful, wonderful comments, Widefield, Javon. It challenged what I was usually taught to respond to stressful law enforcement. And that's really something we like to hear at Lyric. We want to make sure we get challenged. We want to remind you that you have a lot of power in these situations, that kind of falls on you. Did anyone else have any other comments or questions? Great. Well, that was a lot of really great insight. I am excited for this group already. I can't even tell you. But before we get too far into the presentation, one thing I want to reinforce and stress is safety is your #1 priority anytime you're in contact with law enforcement. And a question that I know I get a lot working with Lyric is, will police stop doing what they're doing after I learn these rights? And the most simple version of this answer is these aren't magic words. When you're interacting with law enforcement, they're in charge of that situation. What these words do is help make your lawyer and you in charge of the situation later on. So we want to reinforce that complying as safely as possible is important. Say the lines from our Give 'em 5 card. Feel free to be repetitive verbally. Again, like was noted in the comments, your voice is your action. That should be your action. Don't ever feel like you should end up in a tug of war for your belongings, but don't be afraid to be repetitive. Physically comply, but verbally exercise your rights. That's kind of the separation I always like to communicate. These words allow you and your lawyer to be the people in charge of the situation after it has acted. It allows your lawyer to defend you later. But in the moment, it's important to be reminded that law enforcement are in charge of the situation before then, and your safety is the #1 concern. Never do something that makes you feel unsafe, but we do have a lot of things you can still do to try and ensure that safety. And another fun fact about this, and this is something you tell friends, family, because I know it's kind of considered a controversial opinion, but the Constitution is very clear about this. Your constitutional rights apply to you no matter what your immigration status is, no matter your documentation status. It's about persons in the United States, not citizens in the United States. And the framers are very careful about choosing that terminology. So that's something that we always like to make sure you remember at the first interaction, no matter what, these rights apply. And just making sure to keep an eye on the chat too. Another little fun fact that can sometimes get confused out there is you, 18 and younger, still have all the same rights as any adult in the US. There's no difference to your rights. Actually, I shouldn't say no difference. You might actually have some more protections than adults when you're interacting with law enforcement. But anything you've seen on Law and Order or courtroom dramas, those amendments apply to children and students and teenagers as much as they apply to any adult in the United States. And it can sometimes be easy to not forget that, but to not know that when it feels like you don't have as much freedom or autonomy. The truth is the Constitution makes sure you're protected just as much. So we're going to do a little bit of a kind of interaction. Again, this is something you can feel free to throw up an answer in the chat or jump in with a comment or question. But the Fourth Amendment is where we're starting, and that talks about searches and seizures. And while those words might have a meaning to us, these ones were written a long time ago and applied in a way that we literally in law school spend weeks talking about what a search means in the Constitution, and then more weeks talking about what a seizure means. And so we're going to try and funnel that down. But before I get started, can anyone tell me what a search means to them, or what they think a search means in this context? And I do want to reinforce there's no wrong answers because, like I said, we spent a lot of time debating this in law school.
Karl, would a pat down be considered a search?
A pat down would be considered a search. That is absolutely a wonderful note. A pat down is a search. Anytime your person is examined for contents, that counts. Riley says to search persons, body, vehicles, or belongings. And we have another comment to look for a specific item you feel is present within the area you're looking. These are wonderful definitions. You guys are really on top of it this morning, which is really cool for a Saturday, because I've done this presentation before and I'm still warming up. So you guys are doing great. These are phenomenal descriptions of a search. Anytime someone is searching, and again, in this context, if law enforcement officers are searching your person with a pat down, like Marissa said, or like has been described in the comments, your things, your vehicle and belongings is key. That can be your coat, that can be your backpack, that can be your home, your whole house. It's anytime a law enforcement officer is looking through your belongings, and belongings can have a very broad term. That can even extend to, like, if you're holding a shopping bag from Walmart or Target and you have that on your person, that counts. If a law enforcement officer tries to see what's inside, that constitutes a search. What if they see it without touching anything? That's a very good question. And there's a doctrine that we won't get into in this presentation as much as I would like it. We would if we had more time, but it's called the plain view doctrine. If they can see it from where they are, that does not count as a search. If it's visible, if you're kind of wearing it on you, if the bag is completely see-through, that is different. But like any contents in your backpack, that does count. Cell phones is another really good example, and a question I get a lot, and we'll definitely talk more about cell phones. But for example, right now, I've got a lot of information in my phone, but I've got 3 text messages up right now that I'm ignoring because I want to be respectful of our time and not be on my phone while I'm presenting. But I have no idea what people are texting me right now. And if an officer had my phone and could just look at my home screen, he could see what my mom has to say and what a couple of my friends have to say, and that does not count as a search. But getting into the phone, anytime you imagine, like if it's looking on the outside of the container, that's not a search. Looking in the container is a search. Wonderful question. And now I'm going to turn another question back to you, which you probably all predicted that I was going to do. Seizure has a lot of needs. If you don't give consent, doesn't an officer need a warrant? Very good question. We're going to cover that in a little bit here about what and when a warrant is required. With your phone especially, absolutely. And we're going to talk about consent and how to make sure you don't give consent in these situations. But yes, if you don't give consent, the officer technically needs a warrant, but there have been situations where officers don't comply with those rules, and it's unfair. But we're going to talk about how you can handle that situation to ensure your rights are protected. Really great question. Please keep these coming. But my question to you is now, what is a seizure? There's a lot of terms. My brother is a doctor at VU Health. He has a different definition than I do. So feel free to let me know what you think. Because I can say it's also, especially in this context, funky word, outdated. Yeah, to seize an object. To take items they believe played a part in a crime you may have committed. For warrants, they must have an affidavit. Close enough, no worries. And taking items for evidence. This is all wonderful feedback once again, and all correct. These are all instances of seizure, but there's an added layer to what can count as a seizure, and that's if you yourself are detained. So kind of like how with searches, it could be you as a person, your things. If you or your things are taken from you for any reason, for evidence, for questioning, that's a seizure. And so if you're arrested, that's kind of an easy one to tell. I won't say easy, but you're definitely seized. But it might also mean you're in a room and there's a police officer at the door and they say, you cannot leave. And they guard the door. You have been seized. So you can be seized as well as your things. And so the Fourth Amendment protects you from what the Constitution calls unreasonable searches and seizures. There's a whole lot of words to the Fourth Amendment. a whole lot of sentences, but this is the core. You are protected against unreasonable searches and seizures. But the Fourth Amendment applies only to government actors, specifically law enforcement. So I do always like to reinforce that this does not apply to like your family, your friends, your teachers in every situation. Great question. What makes it reasonable? Reasonable searches are kind of like some of the comments have said so far. When there's reason to believe that you or someone in your car or in your home committed a crime. They need to have reasonable suspicion. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. But if they, a good kind of example would be, someone just stole a red SUV and you happen to be driving your own red SUV or in a red SUV and you get pulled over for that reason. That's a reason to stop you. That's a reasonable reason to stop. Likewise, the local 7-Eleven says, hey, someone just robbed me and stuffed a whole bunch of things in a neon green tote bag, and you happen to be carrying a neon green tote bag. That's a reasonable reason to have a search or seizure. But even in those situations, you have protections against them deciding to search. What is reasonable is different from what a police officer thinks is reasonable, but the police officer just has to be able to say, I reasonably thought a crime was being committed, was about to be committed, or had been committed. But we can still talk about the situations that you can protect yourself in. But just to quickly reinforce, you can try to tell your mom that your Fourth Amendment protects you from her searching your things. It doesn't. You can try. You're welcome to try, but don't say that Karl said it would work. That's all I ask as we go forward on that. Real great questions. We're going to talk a little bit more. And so speaking of moments that are reasonable for officers to approach you or law enforcement officers to approach you. And this one, I would like to just kind of throw it up in the chat, A, B, or C for this quick pop quiz. Can a police officer approach you on the street and ask you questions? A, yes, always. B, no, never. Or C, only if I've done something wrong. Great. I don't know if we're all answering A or if we're all bored and going, ah. But the correct answer in this case is yes, always. The way I like to think about this is a police officer is just a person on the street until something else happens. And the reason for that is it's like if you were walking on the street and I was passing you, staying socially distanced this day and age, but I could ask you, hey, do you know what time it is? Do you know where the nearest gas station is? Police officers are allowed to do that. They are allowed to just ask questions. Hey, have you seen anything funny over here? Or hey, have you seen a dog? Or that sort of thing. They're allowed, just like any other person, to ask you questions when they approach you. But you don't have to answer them. You don't have to answer any of their questions, except there are two things you have to answer when a police officer asks you for them. Can anyone throw up in the chat or just say out loud what they think at least one of those two things are that you have to tell a police officer if they ask you for it? Your name. Your name, yes. They can ask for identification. Your name is the key part of this. Insurance, if you're driving a vehicle, yes, you do have to give them your insurance. I see birthday, I see where you're headed. And so a quick note, because a lot of officers will make it seem, or probably have told you, that you have to tell them where you're going. You absolutely do not have to say where you're going. You don't have to say where you've been. You don't have to say where you're headed. And we're going to talk about why it's a good idea not to, even if you've not done anything wrong, which is usually the case. The two things are your correct name and your correct birthday. That is it. They can ask for those things, and those you have to give it. You cannot tell them a fake name or a fake birthday. And you might be thinking, oh, if you're armed, that's a wonderful note. It can be very important to let them know if you're armed in the moment. You don't constitutionally have to. It can be for safety for the situation, so nothing surprises them later on. So that's one of those weird balances where you have to kind of see where you're comfortable. You are not constitutionally required to let them know you're armed as long as you are legally armed. If you're illegally armed, that's a whole other story that we won't go into right now, but that is not one of those things that you have to do. I see the question, if they ask you where you're going and you don't want to say, should you respond? We're going to cover this as we go on too. The answer to that is, I want to remain silent if they push you on it. But what you can say before that, if they ask any question, what should you tell them? So that's a wonderful question. And one of the classes I'm in right now is gender identity in the law. And this is rapidly evolving and we're having a lot of trouble keeping up on this. I'll say we're doing great as advocates. The law tends to move very slowly. You are best off using your legal name for what's on your ID. There are situations where if your name is different than what's on your legal ID, but that's what people know you by, or your name, or what's most commonly recognized, that you can do it. But in general, you're safest with whatever's on your legal ID. Because if the situation happens that you happen to be arrested through circumstances out of your control, you want your ID matching what you told the officers so they don't try and claim that you were lying to them. And so I'm going to get back to our how should you respond a little more, because that comes next on our next slide. But before I do, can anyone tell me why they think it would be bad to lie to the police if they can't ask you more questions other than your name and ID? I'm sorry, name and date of birth.
If they have your ID, can't they search your name and see and have like a picture of your ID and then have like false information and stuff, and they can use it against you?
They sure could use it against you. And I'm seeing a lot, they can use it against you. Yeah, if you haven't done anything wrong, but then you lie about your name to police, then you've done something that they can count as illegal. And at that point, that's when you find yourself in a much more drawn out interaction with law enforcement than you might have originally wanted to. So that's exactly right. You can get in trouble at that point, even if you've done nothing wrong before then. And it's technically a criminal offense. So you go from having done nothing wrong to a criminal offense. But I saw the question pop up, after providing this information, I want to remain silent. And that can make you feel like you're being kind of sketchy. That would be fraud, yes. Yes, correct. That would be fraud, criminal offense in fraudulent behavior with a police officer. But you can say, I want to remain silent. There's even something else that you can say once those questions are asked, and we're going to go over that coming up here. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss any of the comments because we're getting so many great comments in here. But yeah, when you say I want to remain silent, there's a key thing you have to do after you say that, and that's actually remain silent. And that can sound silly, but even if you've said I want to remain silent and then decide to start talking, that's, again, like we said with the question earlier, that's a way you've waived your right to remain silent. Even after you've invoked it, if you start talking again, that's fair game. What I want to remain silent says is police aren't allowed to keep asking you questions. They have to stop. They can ask later, and the courts kind of debate about how long that has to be. They can come back and say, have you waived your right to remain silent? But other than that, they can't keep asking you questions after you've said, I want to remain silent. And so we're going to do another quick pop quiz, which kind of goes to the other, if you're getting asked questions, more questions than you want to answer, there's something else you can do. So if a police officer approaches you on the street, can they stop you from leaving? A, yes, always. No, never. C, yes, if the officer thinks you have done something wrong. Great. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of people that could probably help me teach this presentation. The correct answer is C, yes, if the officer thinks you have done something wrong. And this is the other thing that I like to make sure we say when dealing with this. If you're not sure whether or not you are being detained, ask, am I free to leave? And to answer that question that we had earlier about, what if they ask where you're headed? If they say, hey, where are you going? And you don't want to say, you can say, am I free to leave? And then they have to decide whether you're being detained at that point. And more often than not, you've communicated that you are someone who's aware of your constitutional rights, and it takes so you could say, am I free to leave? And that question becomes, they have to do a lot more work if they choose to detain you at that point. And hypothetically, so that's a very good question, and it's something that definitely we want to make sure we're ready and protected for. It certainly is illegal. One of the troubles we run into is seeking representation, because what you'd want in this situation is a lawyer, and contacting a lawyer. Oh, that was a private message. I'm going to respond to that privately. I even see a little private parentheses. But anyway, seeing Marissa's question. So I will get back to that. I got a private message, and so I'm going to respond to that in private, respectfully, because even though I'm not a lawyer yet, I've been learning all the rules to keeping secrets, and I'll make sure I do that. But Marissa, I've had students say their parents told them to ask for them to not ask for them to ask for if they are arrested. Do you think that's best? So we're going to cover attorneys and what to do and what you should do. And I promise I'm not biased just because I'm a law student. We believe that getting an attorney involved as soon as possible, and again, you don't want to do it like, if an officer walks up to you on the street and says, hey, where are you going? Don't say, I want my attorney. That's not the time for it. Go through our other lines from our script. But if you become detained, then you're going to want to ask for an attorney. And we're going to talk about exactly why. And that's a great question, Caleb. This happens a lot. It absolutely happens a lot. So you say your lines, you use the power of your voice, and they keep bothering you anyway. What you do is keep notes of what's happening and repeat yourself as you feel safe doing. Continue to say, am I free to leave? If they say no, then I want to remain silent. And well, fine, but where are you going? I want to remain silent. No, but where are you going? And just practice. And that's where it gets very scary. And that's why practicing these lines, so it becomes very second nature, is so important, because your repetition is what helps you there. And then remember what happens as best you can. Because when you get to talk to a lawyer later, you can say, I said it, I want to remain silent, like 9 times. And that officer kept asking me questions. That's what empowers you and your lawyer later on to get that officer in trouble. What happens very often is someone will be in an interaction with the law enforcement officer, and it's the 6th or 7th time they've tried to say, I want to remain silent. And finally they give up. They're like, fine, look, I wasn't doing anything. I was going here, leave me alone. But there's something that was in that response that the officer thinks is even more suspicious than wanting to remain silent. And then you might find yourself arrested, and you've waived your right by answering questions in that moment, even if they pestered you. There's still some things your lawyer can do, but your best effort is repetition. And repetition is your best saving grace. And the more you have to repeat yourself, the better it goes for you in the future. What I will say though is there might be times where you feel uncomfortable, unsafe being repetitive. Keep your safety in mind. There might be a point where you finally do feel you have to relent for your physical safety, and you do have to say something. You haven't lost all protections at that point. If you are coerced into speaking, that's a whole nother thing. And you waiving your rights doesn't count as waiving. It counts as your rights being coerced away. So really good questions. And we're going to see how much more we can get into that as this presentation continues. But definitely keep them coming. I could not be more grateful for these questions. And so that's why we have our Give Them 5 card, just to go over it again, just to have it up since you can't hold it in your hands. Am I free to leave? If so, carefully walk away. Carefully walk away, and emphasis on carefully as we reinforce safety as much as we can. If you say, am I free to leave? And the officer says yes, you should walk away slowly. Be careful, just don't do anything, no sudden movements, just carry on and try and get to a safe location as quickly as possible. But as carefully as possible, entering a convenience store or a grocery store, or just feeling a place where you feel is high visibility can be safe, but just carefully walk away. If the officer says no, that's when you're being detained or seized, like we were talking about earlier, and you have to stay. You don't get to walk away, and you definitely shouldn't run away. When the officer says no, you've officially been detained, and that opens up some more of our lines that we practice. But we were talking about this a little earlier, so I think I know we're going to get some quick answers. A police officer may ask if they can. Oh, is there a question? Yes. Was that, did I hear someone? No. A police officer may ask if they can search you, your backpack, or your other personal items. And we talked about this earlier. What do you say in that situation? I did a little flash answer, but what should you say if an officer asks if they can search your belongings? Because in this case, what I can say is the right to remain silent won't help you here. Great, yes. That is correct. So there will be situations where it feels very, very intense, very scary. And you might feel like you have to, but there's a balance you strike, and that is that you say, I do not consent, like we had in the video earlier. I do not consent to you searching my stuff. You can be specific. I don't consent to you searching my backpack, but you can be as broad as I do not consent to you searching my stuff. That's what you say. But, and if you do that, they're not allowed to, like we talked earlier, without much more probable cause and or a warrant. And that's why we have that as number 5 on our card. There'll be lots of situations. That counts if it's your car. That counts if it's your backpack. If you want to say property, you can say property. The good news is you don't have to be specific under the Constitution, as long as anyone would reasonably understand you're talking about your stuff. But the more specific you're comfortable being, be comfortable. I do not consent to you searching my property can absolutely be a good way to go. One thing we always encourage is when you're broad or very specific, it's about these things in particular. So as long as you're communicating the objects of import, then you're good to go. Riley, yes.
So if you don't give consent to search and they have a canine with them, are they able to use their canine to search your car? And then if the canine alerts to anything like in your car or on your body or anything like that, can they search you then?
So that's a really interesting question. I'm gonna try and tackle that quick because it is very important. So the answer is, and Colorado is a little different, as we have a different kind of set of laws than the rest of the nation. And one of the things that happens about that is if a dog alerts, then yes, that counts as probable cause for them to search. You can still say, I do not consent. Saying I do not consent makes it so that way they have to do everything perfectly right. And if you say you don't consent, even after a dog has alerted, your lawyer gets empowered in the future. The other thing to note, though, is they can't call a drug sniffing dog if you were pulled over for a broken tail light or for missing a turn signal, etc. They can't hold you for longer than what they pulled you over for is being taken into account. But they might do it anyway, and that happens a lot. And so what we always say is keep track of what happened. I was pulled over. They said I didn't turn signal long enough, and then I was stuck for 25 minutes until a dog showed up, and then they sniffed the car. That all has protection. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that great question. And I remember reading a story about a guy who was denied the right to a lawyer because he said, I want a lawyer dog. Could you elaborate on that some point? Yeah. So one of the other things that can be troublesome is you have to remember that when you're invoking your right, you have to invoke it in a way that a judge who is usually very old and has not, doesn't do a lot apart from the law would say, yes, they invoked their right. And so being as specific as possible is your best protection. I would argue against anyone who said that I want a lawyer dog does not mean wasn't invoking that right, but that's why we have this presentation, is kind of the specific words that best protect you. And so saying, I want a lawyer and just leaving it at that also helps you say as little as possible, which is another thing we want to reinforce. So that's a great question. Basically, just imagine the oldest legal mind in the state has to understand what you were trying to ask for. And that's why we are about kind of the Give them 5 script. So great questions. And this is something we were just talking about, so we won't touch on it too long. But let's say the police officer, you say, I do not consent, and they start searching your stuff anyway, or they don't even ask. They just walk up and start going through your backpack. What should you do in that situation, or what should you say?
I do not consent.
Great. Yes. Yeah. You can always ask for a lawyer, but so you can. This is absolutely a time you can do that. So that's absolutely an option. But like was said out loud, I do not consent. Still say it. Still say I do not consent to you searching my stuff. But this is where we're talking about that kind of the difference between saying something and physically doing something. Do not try to physically prevent the search. That's another moment where you can get in trouble. Or you can, again, raise the stakes and make this an uncomfortable situation. If the officer feels unsafe, we know a lot about how it doesn't take much for an officer to claim they felt unsafe. So you can say, I do not consent, but physically comply. They might be saying, put your hands on the car, spread your legs, et cetera, but you still say, I do not consent to you searching my stuff as you physically comply to the situation. I'm going to go ahead and we talked a little about cell phones. So if you do not consent to a search, are they allowed to search your phone? We talked a little about this earlier, so you got a little bit of a hint, but A, yes, B, no, C, only with a warrant. Yeah. You all have this. That's absolutely right. This is only with a warrant. Your phone, one of the things that's a bit of a trick is the courts aren't evolving as fast as technology is, so they're still trying to catch up on this, but right now the current rule is yes, only with a warrant. We talked a little bit about how they can see what's on your screen. That's allowed to be seen. So it can be, if you're not comfortable with that, check your notification settings and make sure nothing pops up on your home screen that you wouldn't want. I don't even say the law enforcement officers, but like someone sitting next to you on a train. If you don't want a stranger to see it, keep it off your home screen. And before we get to that, the other thing I was going to say is a lot of people ask, well, what if my phone is password protected? If you have a facial recognition, like a fingerprint, and again, I'll just say somehow the phone gets opened via one of those, then the officer has a lot more leeway to look through your phone. But if you have a passcode or one of those little dot patterns or numbers or letters or whatever, that is protected knowledge in your head that they are not allowed to ask you for. And that can protect your phone a little better. And so now, when can an officer stop you when you're in the car? What kind of situation can an officer stop the car you're in? And I'm going to be honest, we could probably talk all day about situations where you get pulled over. I know I've name dropped a couple, like broke a taillight or didn't signal correctly. Traffic violations. That's a thank you, Tanner, for helping. Yeah, to make me condense it in and to search it maybe. That's a very good point. So there's two major situations. If the officer, yes, drunk driving is a great thing, a great note. Anytime you're violating traffic codes or traffic laws, if the officer reasonably believes someone in the car, you or anyone else in the car, has committed a crime or traffic violation. So to Tiana's point, if they think you've committed a crime and need to search for it, like they think that car has weapons, that gives them the do it. So this might feel like they can do it for anything. They can pull you over for any reason. And that's not far off, because Colorado has a law where if you want to change lanes, you have to keep your turn signal on for 100 feet beforehand and then 100 feet after. And I don't want to admit that I'm a criminal, but hypothetically, I don't do that every time. That's something they could pull me over for. And so lots of reasons. So yeah, if you get pulled over, witnesses are your best capacity. And if it's found that there was no reasonable cause for you to pull over, there's actually a case that exact thing happened. In that case, then there's a lot of evidence, or the charges themselves can be dropped from your case entirely. So absolutely, again, this is why not being frustrated, sticking to your script, and acting calmly keeps you from getting any other trouble. Because if you're pulled over and you know you weren't drunk driving, but you react hostily or anything like that, or lie to the officer about your name, that's when you can get into trouble when you hadn't beforehand. Real good note. Now, and we're gonna go real quick. Actually, I won't even ask because you guys have got this down. You've been acing these little pop quizzes. If you're pulled over and the officer asks to search your car, I do not consent to you searching me and my stuff. I do not consent to you searching my car. I do not consent. That's something you can use to protect you in that situation. They might do it anyway. They might get a drug sniffing dog, but as soon as you've said I do not consent, they're then breaking the law. They are violating the Constitution if they continue. So you've set up the barrier. Just being silent can be sometimes perceived as consent. If they say, "Can I search your car?" and you don't say anything, then they might just start doing it, and they can say that there was implicit consent. So always use that voice, "I do not consent." And it's something that I'm trying to do in every situation, and it can be very scary. But there's times where I know there's no big deal happening. But I keep saying that because I want to normalize this, so it's not suspicious to say. Now, real quick, what should you do if police come to your home? I'm sure we've seen some crime drama or Law and Order or something. If an officer is knocking on your door, what's the one thing you want to make sure you see before you open that door? A warrant, yes.
A warrant?
A warrant, Kayla, yes. And this is an important note. Don't even open your door. Don't even open your door if you don't see a warrant. And you might say, "Carl, how am I supposed to see the warrant if I don't open the door?" If you say through the door, "I want to see a warrant," it's up to the officer to figure out how to get it to you. They can slide it under your door. If it's like the picture here and there's a window, they can put it up to the window. I don't know if anyone still has mail slots, but they can slide it to the mail slots. It's up to the officer to find a way to show you the warrant. And kind of like your home screen on your phone, if you open the door and they see something inside that they think is suspicious, even if it's not, then they can do more. You don't want them to see anything. So keep your door closed, wait for a warrant. And it can be hard to identify what a warrant looks like. It usually will say warrant on it, like a movie prop, but it also needs to have your address, what they're looking for. They can't just have your address and be like, "We just want to look through the whole house." They have to be specific. We are looking for a weapon. We are looking for a bunch of money from a bank robbery. We're looking for, and then a judge's signature. And you'd be right to say, "Carl, I don't know what my judge's signature looks like. I don't know what my county judge's signature looks like." If a person's okay, so yeah, so what should homeowners do? So there was actually an issue where ICE agents were using false warrants to gain access. They were actually memos from the ICE agency with fake judges' signatures to get in. Best thing for homeowners to do is record the situation, find ways to have that recording sent to or broadcast to someone that can field it in case everyone in the home is arrested. But recording the interaction is crucial. That's really the best you can do. You can also try and contact the officers, or actual other law enforcement officers, but that can be very tricky. And then you go through all the steps of our script. I want to remain silent. I want a lawyer. I do not consent to you searching my stuff. That's your script becomes, if ICE comes to the door and forces their way in, go right to the script. But yeah, so, and then for the last notes on the warrant, if you're not comfortable, if you see it and you're like, "I don't really know if that's a real warrant," because that has happened before with ICE agents in this state. You can say, "Can you come back when my parents are home?" Or "Can you come back when someone else, a guardian, someone who you feel better making the call on if it's a real warrant or not?" You can then say, "Hey, can you come back when someone else is home?" But speaking of guardians or parents, well, just real quick, can your parent or guardian give consent to police to search your room? And since we're running short on time, I'm going to go ahead and answer this because it's, I think you all got it. Most situations, yes. There's very rare exceptions where the student is renting from their own parents and has a key to their room and only they have the key, but even then, usually parents can give consent. So again, this is to make sure you know how far your rights extend, but also where you won't be able to extend your rights. But again, even if your mom has said so, or your guardian has said so, or your grandma you're living with has said so, still say, I don't consent, because that might be relevant later for your lawyer. And then searches in schools, this is another big thing. One big note is you can be searched at school if officials have reasonable grounds to believe there's a violation of the law or school rules. And school rules can be more strict than the law. For example, you could be 18, you can legally in Colorado own some tobacco and a vape pen, but there might be a school rule that says no tobacco on campus. So they're allowed to search if there is, if you're violating a school rule. But you find yourself in that situation and a principal or a SRO or a police officer that doesn't work for the school wants to search your locker or backpack at school, what do you say? It's our slogan for the day. I do not consent to you searching my stuff. I do not consent to you searching my stuff. And again, you might say, especially in this situation, like I'm worried about getting in trouble with my principal or the SRO, but to go through a quick hypothetical, you have your backpack. You know that all you have in your backpack is s'mores Pop-Tarts, a chemistry book, and your notebook. But what you don't know is someone put in a bag of weed at some point. And so you say, they say, hey, can we check your backpack? And you very confidently go, yes, go ahead. I know there's nothing in there. But then they find that weed, that can be used against you. The fact that they found it, the fact that they looked for it. If you say, I do not consent to you searching my stuff, and then they find it, later on, your lawyer can get removed the fact that they found it and the fact that they even looked for it. So then you won't be able to be charged. And that's a situation where you've done nothing wrong, but you might end up in trouble anyway. So still, always, to give you and your lawyer the power in the future, I do not consent to you searching my stuff. I do not consent to you searching me or my stuff. And again, like I said, I'm an actor, so I'm used to like saying things in the mirror. I absolutely still do this, because even as a law student, these moments can be very intense and intimidating. So you want your lines down. Which brings us to the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent. We've talked a lot about this. I'm comfortable kind of hitting through it. But it gives you the right to remain silent. And like I said earlier, you kind of feel like, oh, if I have the right to remain silent, I'll just stay silent. But there's lots of cases where someone has an interaction with a law enforcement officer, they get arrested, they've been quiet for hours and hours and hours, and police just hound them. That does not change. No. If you say you do not consent, then it's still an evidentiary issue. Police liaison officers in a school setting, same rule, same thing. Even if it's just your principal, often that could be a thing, because the courts often see your principal as acting as a law enforcement officer in those situations enforcing school rules. Again, teachers get a little different, but still, at the end of the day, your best bet is to make sure you inform them you do not consent, protect your safety, and go forward. Say, like we said earlier, when you're invoking your Fifth Amendment rights, kind of like we were talking about specificity, I want to remain silent. You could be as specific as I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, but you don't have to. If you say I want to remain silent, it just has to be a sentence that the officers know you do not intend to keep speaking. Now, Miranda rights, who knows? Again, this is a who knows them moment. Feel free to throw up in the chat anything that you know from the Miranda rights. But I know that the first thing is that Fifth Amendment rights. You have the right to remain silent. But it can be very misleading when an officer says you have the right to remain silent. Then you feel like, yeah, great, then I'm going to be silent. You have to say, I want to remain silent. We also have anything you can say can and will be used against you. That's what we were saying about waiving your Fifth Amendment rights. You have the right to an attorney. And if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed to you. This is important. You don't have to know an attorney. You don't have to have someone to call. You don't have to say, hey, officers, you know, my parents have this attorney. Even if you've never met a lawyer in your life, one is going to be appointed to you from the public defender's office. And I know the public defender's office can often get a bit of a reputation as being have not good lawyers, but the best lawyers I know either started as public defenders or are still public defenders. And public defender lawyers are out to help protect your rights in these situations. They study this stuff constantly. So when I say this is the moment for all of your hard work and all of your lines to pay off, it's when your lawyer is appointed for you. When do you have to have your Miranda rights read? There's some math, and I'm sorry, you probably weren't told there's a little bit of math in this, but it's when you have custody and interrogation, that equals Miranda rights. And custody is anytime you are under arrest or you feel like you're under arrest. And that's so important, especially as students, especially as anyone 18 or younger. Tell your younger siblings this. If they feel like they're under arrest, that counts as custody. And that can be, they're still in school, they're in a detention hall, but there's an officer standing next to them and they don't feel comfortable leaving. That's custody. And so when you add an interrogation, which is questioning by law enforcement, that they have to have read you your Miranda rights before then. If they haven't, you don't really, you don't necessarily get to say like, hey, you haven't read me my Miranda rights yet. What you do go is remember that. And when you get to talk to your lawyer, say, they never read me my Miranda rights before I felt like I was under arrest and they started questioning me. Because when that happens, that's a major violation that the court very much frowns upon, but it requires you communicating that with your lawyer. And interrogation doesn't have to be direct questioning. It can be kind of talking across. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced that. I know my mom's done that before. Like, well, someone smashed my vase, and if someone told me, I wouldn't be as mad. And my dad will be like, yeah, anyone who smashed your vase should tell you right away. There's a very famous case where cops basically did that. They were just talking to each other in the front of the car while the suspect was in the back. Anything that an officer thinks will result in the suspect saying something incriminating counts as interrogation. And I know I'm going kind of quick now, but I do want to make sure I hit all of these things before we go. This is a slide made of really good points by students from previous presentations. Even if you've done nothing wrong, even if you've done nothing to hide, still say, I want to remain silent, because police are legally allowed to lie to you. That's the whole thing behind undercover officers, right? If you couldn't lie, you couldn't be an undercover officer, yet you get in trouble if you lie to them. So you always want your lawyer there to help filter out when police are lying and when you need to tell the truth, and what you need to share with police. You want that, even if you've done nothing wrong. Because another example I've had, and this one I won't even say hypothetically, this happens to a friend of mine's client, where they were walking home from 7-Eleven. An officer said, hey, were you at the 7-Eleven between 2 and 2:15? And my friend's client, who absolutely had done nothing wrong while there, said, yes, I was. And little did he know, 3 minutes after he left, the store was robbed. And that client was then detained as a suspect just because they were present at that point at that time. So even when you've done nothing wrong, saying the wrong thing can end up with more law enforcement interaction than you should have to go through. So always exercise that right to remain silent. And it can be very scary too if you're in an interrogation room. But once you say, I want a lawyer, unlike when you say, I want to remain silent, they can check back in, later that day and be like, hey, are you sure you want to stay silent? But when you say, I want a lawyer, they are not allowed to ask you a single question until your lawyer shows up. And it might take a couple of days, which can be very scary, but it's way better than being in a situation where you say something that lets them hold on to you for even longer, and then your lawyer can't help as much. And that's why we have, I want to remain silent there. And then we talked a little bit about how you have an extra protection. I want my parent is something you can also say. Always say, I want my lawyer. To answer that question we had earlier, your lawyer is your best filter, and you get to talk to your lawyer and keep secrets between the two of you. That can help. You do have the right to have a parent present. What I will say is if you're not comfortable, you don't have to have your parent present. You just get the option to call on that. Consider it a tool in your box to do what you need to do. And then after you've demanded your lawyer, right back to, I want to remain silent. It might be redundant because you've said you want a lawyer and Karl told you that meant they can't ask you more questions, but always, again, you'll never say these things enough. I want to remain silent. Anytime you know you have nothing else to say, I want my lawyer, I want to remain silent, and then stay silent. So I've got, I want my parents. And again, why would you want your lawyer there over like a trusted parent or a teacher or a friend? Anything you tell guardians, teachers, friends can be used against you in court of law. And if you go to court, they can be summoned to testify against you, and they're put in an awkward place where they'd have to lie, which is illegal, or testify against you, which would probably break their hearts. And so that's something you always have to remember. But what's cool about your lawyer, anything you tell your lawyer, they have to keep secret. And I know many lawyers that their clients say, I did do this thing, but here's these other reasons. The lawyer's never going to go, all right, well, I'm going to go tell on you. And they'll never be called to testify against you. They're your safe spot, and lawyers will be able to do their job better the more honest you are and the more thorough you are. And you have a right to an attorney. Whether or not you can afford one, you get an attorney, and it's up to the state to provide it to you, and you will get one. But your lawyer is the one you can tell everything. And this can get stressful too. Your parents might say, hey, tell us what happened, tell us everything. But you can say, and feel free to refer them. And we've even had parents contact Lyric, say, here's Lyric's contact info. Please, they said this, and here's the reasons why. And it's not you. It's just I never want to put you in that awkward situation. So always ask if you want a lawyer. Oh yes, that's a great question. How do we keep so many secrets? Well, practice. That's one of the big things about law school. We do a whole class, a whole semester on legal ethics and secret keeping. And lawyers, when we are interrogated, we get to go, this is attorney-client privilege. And that's like our magic words, like your rights we're talking over here. When we say, hey, it's attorney-client privilege, the court is not allowed to ask us about that. Not a single detail. They're not allowed to interrogate us at all. And the reason for that is so that way we have a functioning legal system where people can trust their lawyers. And so there's the one more look at the Give Them 5 card. I do want to take a second before the whole thing concludes. What should you say in these situations? Is this script, but always keep your safety in mind. Always make sure you're doing what you feel is safe. And sometimes that means complying with things you know is wrong now, because you're better set than I was my first year of law school. I finished my first year of law school and I still didn't know this stuff. It wasn't until like 3L where I took a criminal procedure class and was like, I have all these rights? Well, and then I joined up with Lyric to make sure everyone else knew. So you'll be in situations where you know you have rights that might be being violated a little bit. Keep your safety in mind first, but stick to the script so that way your lawyer can help going forward with fixing the issues. And normally I'd say any questions. What I will say, since I think we've reached time exactly, which I'm both proud of and a little sad because I wanted a little more time for questions, is feel free to email instructors for today, questions you do have that I didn't answer. I know I have one student's private message that I didn't get to respond to yet. So if you can send me another just private, say that question was mine, feel free to just drop that in the chat right now, and then I'll make sure I get that back to you, to instructors to disseminate information. But to answer that kind of question very broadly, always get an attorney involved. Find a way to get an attorney involved. Cops will do things that are illegal sometimes, and that's an unfortunate truth, and that's something we're dealing with a lot. I'm not saying all cops are bad or that everyone does that, but you want your lawyers involved the second, because you might even be told by an officer, hey, I'm allowed to do this, and chances are that's not correct. And only when you have an attorney to help you out can you get that fixed, because more often than not, what they're doing is something that they might not even know is wrong, because maybe their boss told them, yes, you have the right to do that, but their boss wasn't right. So I'm going to sigh now that we got to the end of this presentation. Thank you so much for being so wonderfully engaged, for focusing so well. I couldn't be more grateful for all of your time here. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. But like I said, any more questions, we'll find a way to get communication back. And thank you for the time and focus.
Thank you, Karl, and thanks to Lyric for allowing us to borrow you today. That was very informative, and I'm sure our students greatly appreciate it. So again, like Karl said, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and Karl will answer those for you. But that concludes us for our Leadership Academy today. We will pick up March 6th, so exactly in 1 month, we will have our next Leadership Academy meeting. So you guys go out, enjoy the day. I don't know if it's nice out, but hopefully it is. Go get some sun.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.